Hey everyone, good day to all of you. Hope you're all doing well. So this is going to be the second video on this build. Today I'm going to be talking about the lower. So if you're interested in this upper, this is a CMMG descent, which I did a previous video on. So if you want to know more about this, then just check that video out. This is going to be purely on the lower. So this is an LWRC IC ambidextrous AR-15 lower. Do want to mention, of course, this is just a regular lower. You can fit pretty much any upper onto here. Caveat being this Ambi bolt paddle here might interfere with a few uppers, but by and large, this is a standard lower and does come with a buffer tube. Normally, the only reason I have this whole folding setup here is for the CMMG descent, since this is a bufferless upper. But other than that, yeah, totally normal AR-15 parts with a buffer and whatever else we want to do back here, which I will go over later. But I wanted to start this video by talking about the Ambi features on here. I do think that's the biggest draw of this lower. So to preface this, the type of Ambi lowers I have the most experience with prior to this are mostly going to be with the ADM family of lowers, which that whole system is pretty much the exact same as Griffin's lowers, and beyond that I have a fair bit of experience with the HK lowers as well. But this is really my first time trying out a lower where it has the mirrored type of setup, where you have of course, the regular left side bolt paddle, as well as the right side one, just identical, albeit just a little bit further back to clear the ejection port cover here. So to start on the bolt paddles right here, these are of course completely proprietary to this lower. So the profile of it is just your standard mil spec on both sides. Personally, I do prefer a bit of an enlarged paddle, especially on the left side for when I'm doing a reload and pressing in here. It's not really a deal breaker, I would say, to me to have just your standard type of paddle, but just a little preference, yeah, I would prefer it to be enlarged. One thing I did notice on this setup is relative to a lot of the other Ambi lowers I'm used to, this mirrored setup has a fair bit more complexity to it, and so maybe that has something to do with it, but what I've noticed is this is rather extremely stiff of a bolt catch compared to any other Ambi or non-Ambi lower that I've used. So when I'm doing a reload, even if I'm using just the regular left side paddle or this right side one and trying to do a reload and closing the bolt on an empty mag, it is just very, very stiff and has a lot of resistance to it. That is on any upper that I've tested this on. One caveat is I do have thousands of rounds on this lower now, and it has worn in a little bit. It's not as stiff as when I first got it, but it is still significantly more compared to any other lower that I have. As far as the ergonomics itself, personally, I'm still much more of a fan of having just a lever on this side. Like I said, kind of like the ADM lowers or the HK lowers. One complaint I did always have though with the ADM style of Ambi is their bolt catch on the left side and on the right side was actually two separate pieces, and there was always a little bit of additional slop in the system. It always would kind of rattle, which was annoying. Compared to this one, even though it is still two separate pieces, it doesn't have any annoying rattle to it whatsoever. I do still prefer just like a one-piece setup like on the HK lower, for instance. One potential issue you might run into though with this right side bolt paddle is, since it does stick up onto the upper, you do need to make sure that your upper is actually going to fit with it. So on this descent upper, I did have to actually make a little cut in the ejection, or in the brass deflector, which is just made out of polymer on this one. So it was an easy cut to make, but for others, for instance, I did try to test this lower on my SLR Rifleworks upper, and it did not fit on there at all, which was actually surprising to me because that upper I have is, it has a pretty minimal brass deflector, and it doesn't even have a forward assist, but just, I didn't realize it, but the actual outer kind of side profile of that upper just sticks out more than a mil-spec upper, so it would actually push that out all the time and just always engage the bolt catch, which is obviously not going to work. I didn't have any other compatibility issues. And another thing I really, really like about this Ambi bolt catch is everything is pinned in place. It's none of those awful set screws, which I will go to the grave hating, especially because actually just before doing this video, I had one strip out on a different lower. So having everything pinned in place is great because if anything ever does have an issue, which is very unlikely in the first place with a roll pin, but even if it does, you can always just punch it out compared to with set screws, you would risk screwing up the threads, which is what I'm currently dealing with now on that other lower. And just as a bit of a preview, when I start talking about some of the other controls that come on this lower from LWRC, just a pretty big recurring theme. A lot of stuff on here is pinned, which is a huge thumbs up from me. But before I do talk about that, I wanted to talk about the rest of the Ambi controls on this lower. So moving on to the next kind of special one on here, and that's going to be the magazine release. So the right side is just your total, just normal mil-spec button. You can replace it with whatever you want, and that is what I did on mine. This ships with just a normal mil-spec button from LWRC. But on the left side, you actually have this enlarged, again, pretty similar to like the HK lowers, but yeah, quite a lot bigger. I think this is a really, really well thought out Ambi magazine release. So you can see, first off, a little hole drilled up here in the kind of top quadrant, and that perfectly matches up with the hammer pin. So when you're changing out your trigger and your hammer and everything, you don't need to have to take this out. You can just put your punch right through here. That's just really well thought out, little quality of life thing there. And this is also stiff in a good way. So not overly stiff, but stiff enough to where I've never had this inadvertently pressed, even with how large it is. I've never accidentally dropped a mag, no matter what I've been doing out at the range or out in the woods, anything. And furthermore, this has a very generous guard, very generous fence around it, you can see, on both the top and the bottom. So it's very unlikely that you're going to accidentally push this onto anything. And it hasn't been an issue for me in everything that I've been doing either. Now, that being said, if you don't like this, it is just a totally normal magazine release bar. I think that's the correct term for it. So if you want to disable this completely, you can just unscrew it and you can just put in like another standard mil-spec just magazine release bar just right here instead. And actually, to the credit of this lower, I think this is the best implementation of an Ambi mag release that I've used. Comparing this to the I guess I'll start with the ADM lowers. Those have a separate mag release, which I've never had those inadvertently pressed either, but it being a separate part adds a bit more complexity. And again, it is set screwed on. And comparing it to like the HK lowers, I've always found those to be a little bit too easy to depress. I have accidentally dropped magazines on my HK lower where I had an Ambi mag release on one of those HK lowers, I should say, because I did take that off since it was an issue. And just to go back to that ADM lower as well for just a moment, you can remove the left side magazine release on that one as well and just use the standard bar, but you're going to have a rather large gap that actually kind of goes underneath here. It's not the biggest hole, but it is still a kind of an ingress point for dirt and debris potentially. And the last Ambi control that LWRC does put on their lowers here is an Ambi safety, which isn't really that special, and LWRC's implementation of it isn't really revolutionary in any way, because I don't really know how you would for just the safety at this point. But I did replace mine just with a radian, simply because I prefer a 45-degree throw. The one that LWRC ships is a 90-degree, but it's not bad. So for a few things I do really like on LWRC's safety, the levers are pinned in place. If you're worried about removing it though, it's really not hard. It's a pretty large roll pin. I didn't measure it, but it's a very similar size to the bolt catch roll pin. Really overall, the LWRC safety selector levers that come with this, they're quite large. They have quite a bit of serration on them. It will bite into your hand. Whether you like that or not, that's really subjective. I personally don't, but again, you may prefer it, and that's just personal preference there. The original safety was a little bit overly stiff. Again, I don't know what was up with pretty much everything on this lower being a bit overly stiff, but just a little more resistance than I would like to put it on fire. So again, something that was fixed when I put on the radian selector, and it's all fine now. That is another part that is a little bit subjective. You might prefer a slightly stiffer throw. So that's actually it for the Ambi controls on this lower. It's all really the special stuff, so kind of a mixed bag. Obviously, the video isn't over yet. I did want to talk about just everything else going on with this lower, just in case you're curious. So when I bought this lower, it did come completely assembled from LWRC, just as a pistol lower. I suppose I'll start on the original trigger. So this ships with one of LWRC's nickel boron triggers, which is supposed to be an improvement over the regular mil-spec trigger, but internally it's still a single stage, and still I really didn't find it to be an improvement personally. I replaced that, as well as you can tell. Before I did replace it, I did do a trigger pull gauge, so was usually averaging about 6 pounds, 3 ounce. It's not terrible, still way heavier than I would like. I usually like about a 4 pound-ish trigger. That's a nice kind of weight. And yeah, it just had a really long take up. Not really any slop not really much over travel either. So it's not a bad trigger, but it's pretty much just a smooth mil-spec trigger. And for me, I'm just a huge fan of two-stage triggers, so just a single stage was pretty much a no-go for me there. Next, moving to the whole buffer tube and that whole setup that came on here originally. Gotta say, I was actually a little bit sad to remove the buffer tube because they did such an amazing job of staking it. It was a really pretty staking. Obviously I did because I wanted to use it with a bufferless setup. It was only staked in one spot, just I think because of how their end plate is shaped, it doesn't really have room to be staked anywhere else. So obviously that part is not mil-spec because it should be staked in two places, but wasn't really an issue. But the buffer tube it comes with, so mil-spec buffer tube, standard castle nut, but LWRC actually has a special end plate that they ship this with that has a QD adapter on it. So the one I had just had one QD socket underneath the buffer tube. I've seen on more recent photos, it looks like they might have moved that to being on the sides instead. So I'm not sure which one's the newer or later one because it is on the same model of lower, but just be aware the exact placement might change a little bit, but either way, yeah, there is a QD adapter on there. Also, one small thing that kind of bothered me on this lower, this ships with a winterized so-called trigger guard. You'll see it in the pictures because that's yet another part I switched out. And the reason I switched that one out was because although it claims to be winterized, if you look carefully at the middle of it, there's actually a ridge where it peaks up right in front of the trigger. And I noticed that it would somewhat interfere with larger gloves. Just about ready to finish up this video, but I did actually want to talk a little bit about the fitment of this lower and how well it fits on all the other uppers that I've tried it on. And it's been really good. This is a very well manufactured, very tight tolerances on this lower. And they do a few other things internally, which I'll show as well, but just overall, it has had really no play whatsoever with every upper I've put it on. So part of that is because internally, underneath the takedown pin, you have actually a little rubber plug shim that goes in, and you can remove it really easily if it doesn't fit for you, which I actually did have to remove this rubber shim on my HK uppers because they have their own thing going on the takedown pin area that tightens it up. But with something like this CMMG Descent upper, I put in that shim and there is literally no play. And actually, even if I take that rubber plug out, it's still a very, very tight fit. So it's very good there. Interestingly, if you do take that plug out, you'll actually see it is threaded underneath here for, you could put like one of those set screws in to push against the upper to really tighten it down if you want to do that. It just doesn't ship with one. One thing interesting actually, I didn't touch on, this does ship with their LWRC's combat grip, which is kind of a mix. So it has a scaled section that is a rubberized, like a Hogue type of grip, but then the rest of it's just hard polymer, like a regular Magpul. Not really a fan of that. But interestingly, if you look on the inside of it, it actually has two holes, one in the back, so you could actually access a set screw for that tension if you so chose to install one. But also, one thing weird is that combat grip is installed using an actual bolt. I'll put the exact size if I can find it up on the screen, but not your normal type of grip screw. So I had a little bit of difficulty getting it removed because I had to find a socket small enough to fit in that original grip. And this lower is made from 7075 forged aluminum, so I am always a huge fan of forged lowers, so it's just one of those really small things, and there's a lot of really small things on this lower that I really like. This is, of course, Cerakote as well from LWRC. This is in their FDE color. They offer actually quite a few different colors, and I haven't had any issues with the Cerakote. It's well applied. The only part where I've really noticed any wear is underneath the pivot pin area from when I'm opening up the upper, and it just collides there. Other than that tiny little scratch there, pretty much, the rest of it is still absolutely perfect. So overall, I actually really like this lower. Even with some of my complaints with it, like I said, I think my biggest complaint with it is just how stiff the bolt catch is. But even with that, this does so many things right that I'm still happy with this lower. It is a little bit on the expensive side, unfortunately. Well, actually a little bit more than a little, but even with that all being said, it's a very, very solid lower. I don't think you can really go wrong with it if you do decide to go with it. Weird thing for me to say this, even despite liking it, I actually don't like this style of Ambi. Going into it, this was mostly just something I wanted to try out, just because I haven't tried this style of Ambi controls before. But it's something I can get used to, and maybe as I keep using it more and more, I might get the hang of it better, but it's not terrible, and again, that might just be more personal preference there. But hope you all enjoyed this video and found it informative. Thank you for watching. Take care. See you all in the next one.